RAF, who were a little busy at the time. Well, when I learned that we were going to have a Bristol day, I just figured I could do no worse than, or better than going back to my own work on the subject, requested by Osprey. Incidentally, it's a shame that when they finish the Bristol, they don't paint it up in the markings of the one shown, which I'll mention later, from number 62 Squadron, since that is believed to have wounded Lieutenant Lothar von Richthofen for the second of 3 times. And then he could have taken flips up to Bethel to do the same thing to the Fokker DR-1 there. But, well, we'll see what scheme they come up with. The Bristol fighter is one of those legends of World War I that that's the more interesting when you try to investigate them. When I tried to look into the legends behind the Bristol, I found that they are not entirely myth. What I also found out was that perhaps the most dramatic case where Bristols made a difference in World War I was not over the front you might expect. Flying into our presentation here is the Major William W. F.J. Harvey of number 22 Squadron, Royal Flying Corps, 26 Victory Ace, and one-time president of the Cross and Cockade Society of Great Britain, who might sum up with some prejudice the plane in one of his own descriptions. Curious feature of the types of British aircraft of 1914 and 1918 was their marked individuality, like so many of those who flew them. Some were hated, some, like the pretty kittenish Sopwith pup, were loved. Some, like the SE-5 and the old workhorse F.2A, were respected for their sterling qualities. The Farmans were funny jokes. 1 or 2 others were jokes of rather poor taste. And then there was the Camel, that fantastic brainchild of Sopwith, which was both feared and respected. There was only one which was both respected and loved by all who flew it, the Bristol fighter. Well, the Bristol's origins actually began in 1916 when the Royal Flying Corps started looking for a plane better able to defend itself than the painfully vulnerable BE-2C. The Royal Aircraft Factory, which created it, came up with the RE-8, which was basically a BE-2C with a little more power and a little change in arrangement, particularly to finally put the pilot up front and the observer in the rear with a ring-mounted machine gun instead of being stuck in the middle of all those wires and struts to defend himself. But meanwhile, the British Aeroplane Limited in Bristol took it somewhat more from the bottom-up tack when its chief engineer, Frank Souter Barnwell, offered a replacement in the form of the R.2A, which had a fuselage raised above the lower wing on struts in order to improve the pilot's view over the upper wing. A revised version had a 150 horsepower Hispano-Suiza engine, and it was designated the R2B, then was quickly superseded by another variant with equal span wings and a new 190 horsepower Rolls-Royce Falcon 1 V12. At that point, the term reconnaissance fighter came into vogue, and incidentally, The term fighter we commonly use in World War I was not what they did in World War I. To the British especially, a fighter was a reconnaissance fighter, which was basically a two-seater capable of carrying out reconnaissance duties, but being better able to defend itself, like the F.2B. A single-seater, armed or not, was originally called a scout, and they continued to for the rest of the war, which is why they changed the R2B into F.2A, gave it side-mounted eared radiators, but then replaced that with a circular radiator in the nose. And when they also tried out 2- and 4-bladed propellers. Well, the RFC was already impressed with its potential, and testing only confirmed its decision to order 50 pre-production examples. These were quickly put into a new squadron, number 48 Squadron, and as was the case with number 56, which at the time was equipping with SE-5 scouts, what you basically had was a cadre of some experienced people and a whole bunch of new replacements. The experienced people in the case of 48 Squadron were Captain Arthur T. Cull, Oxford-educated Captain Alan Machin Wilkinson from Eastbourne, Sussex, who already had 10 victories flying de Havilland DH-2s in 1916 with number 24 Squadron. And finally, there was Captain William Leaf Robinson. Robinson had already become a national hero for destroying Schütterland's airship SL-11 practically right over London in September 1916, the first person to do so in the sight of the people that the German airships were bombing. And for this, he quickly received the Victoria Cross and was lionized as one of the great men of the Royal Flying Corps. So he seemed a natural when they put him in charge of this new fighter flight. Unfortunately, the last time Leif Robinson had been at the front before being wounded and pulled back for home defense duty, he had been flying BE-2Cs and really didn't spend much time figuring out the brand new plane he was supposed to break in. So when he took the F.2A on its inaugural combat flight on April 5th, 1917, he did just about everything wrong you could possibly do with a plane of that potential. He adhered to the standard tactic of closing up the flight when attacked so the rear gunners could give each other mutual support. He also disregarded advice not to fly at the low altitude of 4,000 feet. Wilkinson later said of him, Robinson did not appreciate the fact that the Bristol could be used as an offensive weapon by the pilot, and that it was not necessary to provide one another with protection. We were not bothered about Robinson's VC, only that he seemed to dislike any opinion other than his own, matters of which I might say he had no experience. On top of that, Robinson reportedly had learned that the lubricating oil in machine guns froze at high altitude. The usual remedy for that was to fire them off every now and then, but his solution was to tell the gunnery officer, if the guns are freezing up through the freezing of the oil, stop oiling the guns, and therefore there will be nothing to freeze. So having carried out that order, his flight went off and ran into the Hun, and they couldn't have run into a worse bunch. 5 Albatros D3s from Jagdstaffel 11, led by a veteran by the name of Oberleutnant Manfred Freiherr von Richthofen. As Richthofen later put it, the result was more like a cavalry charge than a battle. In quick order, he shot down 2 of them. One of his men, Sebastian Festner, brought down Robinson and his observer, and Georg Simon shot down a 4th. It was one of those disastrous combat debuts that is covered in another of my books on that subject. What is often overlooked, though, is that Wilkinson led the next patrol, and he had a better idea of what to do with them. And from that time on, the F.2As were doing rather well. They were, of course, not shooting them down in quite the droves that they were claiming, but here is something that comes up along the way frequently. On April 8th, 1917, among the Germans they claimed was Lieutenant Wilhelm Frankl. 20 victories, Ordre pour le Mérite, commander of Yasta 4. It may have been only a fraction of the claims, but Bristol's were, when they were used aggressively as a single-seater with an extra sting in the tail, quite formidable from the beginning. Furthermore, the British began gilding the lily by altering the cockpit in front of the fuselage to give better visibility to the pilot, upgrading the engine, and modifying the empennage to produce the F.2B, an example of which is shown here. And the particular one I show, A707. The 7107 was used by Lieutenant Ralph L. Curtis and Second Lieutenant Lawrence W. Allen to destroy a D3. And on June 16, 1917, Curtis would fly it again with his usual observer, Second Lieutenant Desmond P.F. Uniacke, when they destroyed an Albatross D5 on July 7th. On July 21st, Lieutenant Brian E. Baker and Second Lieutenant G.R. Spencer drove down a D5 out of control, flying that plane, the second of Baker's 12 credited victories. Later in 1917, 48th Squadron adopted the 2 stripes shown here on A7220, which was authorized on August 26, 1917. On that day, Second Lieutenant James A.W. Binney from Scotland and Corporal V. Reed destroyed a 2-seater and drove an Albatross D5 out of control while flying that plane. On September 11th, Binney was flying it again with Lieutenant Thomas C.S. Tuffield as his observer when they downed a DFW out of control near Dixmude. 48th Squadron, therefore, after its bad start, became a quite successful pioneer unit. One of its top pilots, shown on the left here, was a New Zealander who was wounded as an infantryman after doing his almost necessary dues at Gallipoli and then going to the Western Front with the artillery for the British 29th Division, when he was so badly wounded in the back that he was ordered out of service, which he ignored, but seeing as the British Army didn't want him, he just, leaving out completely his medical report, he sent an application to the Royal Flying Corps, was accepted, and went on to score 20 victories with 48th Squadron. You may have heard his name earlier. It's Captain Keith Park. And here he is later in 1918 when he was Major Park and commanding number 48th Squadron. He would score a total of 20 victories in the Bristol and would go on to command 11 Group Fighter Command for the RAF during the Battle of Britain to gain even further fame. And so it went with a number of men and units. The F.2, leftover F.2As and then F.2Bs started making their appearance with number 11 Squadron. A7131 was used by Lieutenant Hugh William Elliott and Second Lieutenant J.W. Ferguson to drive a D-5 out of control. That, for Elliott, it would be the third of 5 victories, which brings up another little matter. With the importance that observers and gunners played in combat, you could become an ace if you sat in the back, at least during World War I. And victories were usually, while the British, unlike the French and the Americans, didn't usually share victories between multiple people, they did make an exception when it came to the two-seaters. The teamwork between the two-seater crews was especially important in the Bristol, and one of its great advantages was the fact that Bristol had put the crews so close together, back to back, so that if it was too loud or too involved for any reason to hear your observer making a suggestion, a few good jabs in the ribs could add to the communication. Here's one of a number of mishaps that occurred to remind you of the fact that Bristols were not invincible. This one was brought down by Vizefeldwebel Friedrich Gille of Jasta 12 on September 19, 1917. Second Lieutenant H.T. Taylor and Lieutenant G.W. Mumford were both wounded and taken prisoner. One of the more intriguing of number 11 Squadron's mishaps occurred when A7231, flown by, which had been used by some of their aces like Henry Scandrett and G. Watson. Later it was flown by Second Lieutenant Ewald Schultz and Second Lieutenant Henry C. Wookie when they were brought down by Vizefeldwebel Carl Bay of Jasta 5 on October 17, 1917. This is a German postcard showing the same plane in their hands. Bay, feeling very pleased with his first victory, had himself photographed with his two former opponents, and they were given the usual courtesies at Jasta 5's aerodrome. But meanwhile, as the Germans investigated their prize, they noticed that they were carrying propaganda leaflets, which in the German army was regarded as an act of espionage. So they were actually put on trial for their lives to be shot for having carried them. They were court-martialed, and whatever lawyer the Germans put at their disposal must have been a good one, because he got it commuted to hard labor as POWs. Perhaps he convinced them that they were either unaware of the presence of those leaflets or pointed out the fact they hadn't thrown them over the side, which would imply that they might have been unaware of their presence. Whatever spiel he gave them, it worked. And the two of them, of course, while sentenced to 10 years, they obviously didn't serve that out. Carl Bay was shot down a little over a month later by Jimmy McCudden of number 52 Squadron. Number 11 Squadron produced the number 1 Bristol fighter ace in the person of Canadian Andy McKeever, who scored a total of 31 victories, including 4 in one action. He's shown here with Harry Goins Kent before F.2B A7121 of number 11 Squadron. He was one of the many aces that 11 Squadron produced, too many to mention perhaps, but except perhaps Another case of a documented victim was Second Lieutenant Herbert Whiteley Sellers and Second Lieutenant Charles Crichton Robeson. One of their victims on March 21st, 1918 was Lieutenant Ludwig Hanstein, 16 victories and recently made commander of Bavarian Jasta 35. Another case of amid the victories claimed, genuine losses and significant ones for the other side. Sellers and Robeson were later shot down by Lieutenant Hans Kirchstein of Jasta 6. Robeson survived to spend out the rest of the war in Karlsruhe prison. Sellers sadly did not. Number 22 Squadron also got its share of Bristols, and also, besides Harvey with his 26 victories, had a number of notables. In this case, Lieutenant Sidney Arthur Oates scored 5 of his 11 victories in this particular Bristol, B 1152. And well, here's a typical scene as they were going off on a mission, with the intelligence officer dropping by to make sure that everyone had emptied his pockets. 22 Squadron was also noted for some of its improvised extra firepower, like this overhead Lewis gun mount, as used by William Harvey, as a matter of fact. With Captain Dennis Edward Waite in the observer pit, he would be credited with 12 victories. The person who came up with these improvised mounts was Ernest Elton, an observer who later became a pilot and would end up credited with 16 victories himself. Another high-scoring ace with number 20 Squadron was Wilfred Beaver, often thought of as an American, but in fact an English citizen who later came to live in Canada. He had well more than... he scored 19 victories, and he's the one on the right. The chap on the left is associated with our cover painting, Captain Geoffrey Forrest Hughes from Australia. He would later serve with 62 Squadron, Beaver with number 20 Squadron. Number 20 Squadron had flown F.2Bs and F.2Ds before it switched to Bristols, and ended up with 613 victories to his credit, making it the highest scoring squadron of World War I. I don't have to tell you that that included a lot of out of controls and dubious claims, as well as the real thing. But the other remarkable thing about 20 Squadron is that its color schemes were arguably the drabbest ever done on any kind of fighting aircraft. They had 2 bars on either end of the cockade, but later got rid of one of them. And after March 22nd, when fighter units changed all their markings to confuse the Hun during his last offensive, and all 2-seater units got rid of their abstract squadron markings entirely. The Bristol units were usually recognizable by the placement, size, and font of their letters or numbers for individual recognition. In the case of 20 Squadron, theirs was small and tucked under the cockpit. It seemed like they reveled in anonymity in spite of their fame. And fame they got. Captain John Herbert Headley was an observer ace, credited with 11 victories, and who claimed that he and Captain R.K. Kirkman were shot down by the Red Baron. Although studies of location and time make it more likely that they were brought down by a lesser ace, Lieutenant Karl Galvitz of Jasta Belgic, which ruined a lot of good stories for Headley. Here's a typical 1918 treatment of number 20 Squadron. Victor Groom scored 9 victories with the unit. And Ernest Hardcastle, as usual observer, was credited with 5. Other aces in the unit included August Thayer and Paul Thayer Yakachi, a couple of brothers who both scored 7 victories apiece with number 20 Squadron. I might add they were both American volunteers with the unit. Number 62 Squadron differed from a lot of the Bristol units in that it treated its aircraft more aggressively than usual, more fighter than reconnaissance.
Right.
There were a couple of units like that. 62 was one of them. And in the case of this plane, this was flown by their leading ace, William E. Bull Statton, another of Canada's contributors. He scored 26 victories before being wounded in September 1918. And hearkening back to our painting, that's how Lothar von Richthofen's DR-1 ended up after running into one Bristol too many on March 13th, 1918. The day before, he had shot down 2 Bristols of number 62 Squadron, and his brother Manfred had accounted for another. But such are the fortunes of war. In all fairness, I might also mention that his plane was credited to a Camel pilot, Augustus Orlebar of number 73 Squadron, or maybe both. The unit shown here is number 88 Squadron, and it also had its share of aces, such as Kenneth B. Kahn, who got 20 victories. He'd been a dancer in Canada before the war. Captain Edward Charles Johnson, who got 19 of his 20 victories in Bristols. And Captain Alan Hepburn, DFC, from Australia, who scored all 16 of his victories in F.2B C-821. He is better known, though, for the plane at the far left, E-4442, which included a symbol of Australia forward of the cockade. Another Bristol unit that got some publicity was number 139 Squadron, whose pilots also used them quite aggressively in a different venue, the Alps, fighting against the Austro-Hungarians. And here again, although they claimed a lot of victories, it seems that the Austro-Hungarians were not quite as intimidated as the Bristol legend would have it. There were claims that German aircraft would not, even in Staffel strength, were hesitant to attack more than 2 Bristols at a time. And that even a single Bristol flown by the likes of Andy McKeever was more than they could handle. Well, at least one Austrian pilot thought otherwise, because several of them were on the score of Lieutenant Friedrich Navratil, commander of Flieger Company 3J. On the other hand, I have documented some actual victories to an Austro-Hungarian loss at the hands of Sidney Dalrymple, who flew, among others, that Bristol you see with the multiple stripes on the tail and the letter S and the Charlie Chaplin emblem as reconstructed in New Zealand. He had scored his first victory in 1916 flying a Martinsyde Elephant, and his other 4 were over Italy. I know for certain that 2 of his victims on were Phoenix D2's the Flieger Company 9J, killing Zugsführer Karl Linner and Feldwebel Johann Pinskalski before he completed his score. Another notable in the unit was Walter Simon, an American from Louisiana who was credited with 5 in one action and 8 overall, although I've been unable to find an Austro-Hungarian loss to match it. But officially that's on his score. The plane shown flying here is a little exceptional because it's being flown by the commander, Major William George Barker from Canada, who is perhaps the highest scoring ace over Italy, but who probably never shot down anything while flying a Bristol. When he got the assignment of commanding the unit, he insisted on bringing his Sopwith Camel with him and preferred to use that, remarked in 139 Squadron markings. But he did fly spy-dropping flights over the enemy lines, and also occasionally took up a special observer who was visiting him at the time, and who's shown in the observer's pit here. Edward, Prince of Wales, who on one occasion is said to have had Barker fly him near enough to the front to fire 2 drums of Lewis machine gun in the general direction of the Austro-Hungarians. Word of those excursions, incidentally, it was noted after that flight that his ability to read maps back at headquarters had gone up exponentially, but word of those excursions reached the ears of King George V, who sternly admonished him for putting himself at risk. There's no question that the Bristol fighter left a stellar record at the Western Front and the Italian Front, and was also used by 5 home defense squadrons against the Gotha menace for the most part. But here's where I find the Bristol really making a difference, and that was raising hell over the Holy Land. Up until August 1917, the matters in Palestine were more or less at stalemate, and one of the reasons was that the Germans had a Fliegerabteilungen 300, 301, 302, 303, and Bavarian 304, plus the provisional Jagdstaffel Pascha, made up of Albatros D3s, escorting them, and they were largely responsible for gathering as much information for the Turks as the British might get for their side. The commander of number 67 Squadron Royal Flying Corps, Captain Richard Williamson, had his own comments to say about the time that Bristols started being allotted to number 111 Squadron Royal Flying Corps out there. For his part, 67 Squadron had a mixed bag of BE-2s, Bristol Scouts, Martinsyde G100 and G102 Elephants, BE-12s, and RE-8s. Because our duty was reconnaissance, it was necessary that we spent most of our time in the air behind the Turkish lines, where we were vulnerable to attack by the German Air Service, who had much superior aircraft. Until number 111 Squadron obtained the Bristol fighters in late 1917, we did not shoot down or capture any enemy airmen, but we did lose many of our own men due to the action of the German Air Service, anti-aircraft fire, and engine failure. By the end of 1917, we were re-equipping with Bristol fighters, and this was the first time that we were in a position to really stand up and attack our opponents. The Germans soon found out about it, and they kept as far away from the Bristol fighters as they could. This aircraft was, I consider, the best service aircraft produced in World War I. It could do any job required to be performed by a pilot and observer, and it could look after itself. Later, after producing several aces of their own, number 111 Squadron started to get SE-5As and Sopwith Camels. Guess who inherited the Bristols? 67 Squadron, which was also underwent a change of name to number 1 Squadron, Australian Flying Corps. Now this is one of, and you saw one earlier also, a rare color photo taken during World War I. It just so happens somebody with one of these expensive cameras turned up. The people in it are Lieutenants Lou Potts and James H. Trail, discussing a recon flight at El Miguel Aerodrome in February 1918. Number 1 Squadron AFC took up where number 111 left off, and I've documented a number of their victories with genuine losses to the German Pasha units, for which they only lost one man who was brought down by 2 or 3 Germans that they were trying to attack, Lieutenant Lawrence H. Smith and Lieutenant Gordon V. Oxenham. Oxenham was killed in the crash. The Turks captured Smith, but handed him over to the German Pasha unit that had brought him down, 304B, and he left some interesting comments on the Germans, which I will quote from. The Germans apparently decided they wanted to keep him. Every time the Turks came to collect him, the Germans would put him down a hole and hide him for up to 2 days at a time. There was always food, water, and reading material, and then after the Turks would leave, I would come up again and we would all go into Haifa in the buggy, a railway car powered by an aircraft engine. Smith went on to say that he rather respected the Germans as far as their occasional attempts to gain information out of them, which of course part of this good treatment was meant to draw out. He said, if they mentioned the name of an officer in my squadron, I simply had to say I didn't know him. Their machines were not always as good as ours, but they still had to go. The Germans didn't like the Turks one bit. I think they liked us better. Anyway, when in late 1917 and early 1918, under the British under General Edmund Allenby started to make things happen. In December, they took Jerusalem, the first Christians to do so since 1291. And they also operated alongside Colonel T.E. Lawrence occasionally, flying him back and forth over the lines. Most tellingly, I have found multiple references in 1918 to members of number 1 Squadron AFC running into flights of German Albatros D5s or false D3s, and the Germans fluttering down and force landing rather than take them on, after which they would strafe them on the ground. They had genuinely taken control of the air. And furthermore, at the time of the Third Battle of Megiddo, in September 1918, The aircraft, which now had full control of the air, put it to the best of use by strafing the Turks and contributing materially to the destruction of the Turkish 7th and 8th armies and the capture of Damascus. On top of that, one AFC produced a disproportionate number of accomplished airmen for the post-war years, such as Ross Smith, who would be the first to fly from England to Australia, Guinea McGuinness and Hudson Fish, who would be co-founders of Queensland and Northern Territory Aerial Services, still around as Qantas, and Lawrence James Wackett, who would be knighted for, as the founder and managing director of the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. All in all, then, the Bristol legend does have a foundation in fact just over an unexpected front. On top of that, the soundness of the Bristol design would keep it in action over the Middle East in the post-war years against God knows how many insurrections, from Iraq to the northwest passages of the Indian subcontinent. And it would still be valid in use as a trainer as late as 1931. It also left behind the concept of the two-seat fighter, which had its good and bad sides over the next 20 years. Among the more silly ideas it produced was the turret fighter, like the Bolton-Paul Defiant, which made the sting in the tail the primary armament, which was a really dumb idea when you're dealing in fighters, which are supposed to be aggressive. And the last thing a fighter pilot needs is being nothing more than a chauffeur for the fellow in the turret. Two-seat fighters were the exception in World War II, although it did also lead to the twin-engine general-purpose fighter, which also proved to be a flawed concept at best. But before we completely dismiss it, all I have to mention is the McDonnell F.4 Phantom to show that in an age of electronics, perhaps having an extra guy in the back seat isn't as defunct a concept after all. Be that as it may, there's no question that the Bristol F.2B fighter is one of World War I's immortals, as it yet another one from 22 sails off into the sunset. If anyone has any questions, I do have a reference for all that.